Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for downloading Sound Bites on Wisp Sports. I'm your host, Dr. Kirstin Lauritzen. This is Season 2, Episode 3. Today's show is going to be about how you can work with your hormones versus feeling like they're always against you. As always, we're going to focus on how we can utilize nutrition to impact our natural hormonal cycle for both the overall health of an athlete and also, of course, performance. We're going to touch a little bit on an area that's also, I think, been neglected for far too long: what happens during and after menopause, and what shifts do you need to make in order to fully explore the possibilities that you can make when you really work on your hormones and understand the differences that happen in the body when we get to that point. So let's dive in. The first question, of course, is always, what are hormones? Typically, when people hear the word hormones, I know that you probably start thinking, oh, those pesky monthly hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, those things that just make my monthly cycles a little bit uncomfortable. And also, I think, too, when we're talking about hormones, we do get into a space where athletes start to shy away from their period in their cycle, especially, obviously, female athletes, but they start to shy away from that because we've heard for so long that, oh, I don't really want to get into the realm of hormones, and oh, can we move your periods around your events around your cycle so that we don't have you competing when you're on your period. And I'm going to break down a lot of that today and why that's really an old way of thinking, and how you can actually use nutrition and what is actually happening with your hormones, and why you don't necessarily need to be as afraid of your period. So when we also talk about hormones, yes, you think about those reproductive hormones, but there's actually quite a few more hormones that are in your body that are doing so much. And the key is to remember that we really want a balance of all these hormones. So for example, there's things like cortisol, which is your stress hormone. You need that hormone in order to do certain things throughout your life. It helps you get up in the morning. It's the balance between cortisol and melatonin that helps you get to sleep. But when that gets out of balance, either in high stress scenarios, or if you are watching a lot of TV and screen time before bed, and that kicks the melatonin hormone out of whack, then we see difficulty with sleep. And so, as you can see, it's really just the balance of those hormones, which is where we want to see, and it's usually the imbalance where we see a lot of problems. Also, there's things like gastrin, which is a hormone that's released in your stomach, and it helps you break down the food you eat. And it's actually really important for overall health. There's things like ghrelin, which is what produces those hunger signals or pains that some people experience. There's things like calcitonin that controls your calcium and potassium levels. There's also things like angiotensin and aldosterone and adrenocorticotropic hormone, which you'll see written out as ACTH, which is actually very important because it acts on your heart and your arteries to raise your blood pressure and control your fluid levels. And that is a very key piece when we are talking about how to keep you hydrated when you're out and running, and especially in the heat. If you're competing at all in very hot scenarios, it's these hormones and how they also interact with progesterone that are very key to understand and know about. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And also, I can't forget to mention thyroid hormones. I can't tell you how many people I see that, especially women, that have some form of thyroid issue and thyroid concern. And so it's one we don't want to forget about. And of course, we're going to talk about nutrition and how to tie all of that in with keeping your hormones in balance when they get imbalanced, and then what that all looks like. So I understand we're not, trying to do a science class here and talk about in depth of all of the hormones, but it is a really great example of why we need to keep things in balance, but why your hormones play such a crazy and intricate role in how your body functions. So let's talk about let's dive in here a bit with an example about thyroid hormones and thyroid concerns. So with the thyroid in particular, we have not only the hormone that's communicating from your brain to your thyroid, but we also have your thyroid making different hormones like T4 and then T3. So we need to make sure that we keep all those hormones in balance, and they can be influenced quite a bit by nutrition. So some other issues that we can see too when we get hormones out of balance are things like mismanaging our reproductive hormones, which can then lead to heat and fluid issues, particularly with female athletes on super hot training days, as I mentioned. Also, chronic exposure to high levels of cortisol, which can happen from being a busy person, but also can happen just from training and having a lot of that external and internal stress of training quite heavily and a lot throughout your day. And I know this, I work in a field with a lot of, and I'm putting in quotes, high achievers, as I think most champions and athletes are to some degree, but also not to mention just fitness enthusiasts in general that are also moms and they have jobs, right? People are busy and it's a lot. And all of this doesn't really come stress-free. And of course, cortisol can create quite a bit of havoc in the body, and we will definitely talk about that a bit later, and you'll see it kind of show up and pop up in different places. But knowing what's happening inside your body is important, because you can use your lifestyle and nutrition to help counteract some of the effects that these kind of hormones have on your body. So let's dive into what are actual hormones. So it's really not until, as I've mentioned, until we really see an imbalance where we start to notice a lot of the issues. We're going to talk a little bit about your female hormones. So diving into, people don't usually know this. When we start talking about estrogen, we're talking about estrone, estriol, and estradiol. You'll see them written as E1, 2, and 3. And they play different roles in the female reproductive system, starting from when you get your period all the way up to menopause. So they are floating around in your body at just different periods of time. And estrogen, knowing where it comes from and how it's made, actually is important when you start to think about when we get to menopause and people start to see, and women start to see that kind of creep of weight a little bit when things start to shift and change. It is part of how we produce estrogen that creates a bit of that. So what happens is estrogen is produced from cholesterol through a series of reactions within the ovaries. The last stage of producing estrogen is actually taking testosterone and converting it to estradiol through an enzyme called aromatase. Now, what's interesting is aromatase is made from fat tissue, so adipose tissue, which when you see higher amounts of fat, it leads to more aromatase, which then can lead to higher levels of circulating estrogen. And that's important because we see higher levels of estrogen for a bit with our post-menopause women. And that's what can lead to that laying down a little bit more fat storage. Also, when you then have laid down a little bit more fat storage and fat tissue, then we see a bit more of this aromatase in the body, and we see higher levels of estrogen. And it's like this kind of never-ending cycle, which is why we're going to talk about later on some key things that you can do and just some shifts that you can make with your nutrition to help counteract this a bit and just find some balance. We're also going to, also something to keep in mind is that I mentioned estrone as one of your female hormones, as one of the pieces of estrogen. And it's actually normally present in young women when they're starting their period, and then later on with menopausal women. So you don't see it too much with cycling women, but in the middle-aged part of their life, but you do see it on the opposite ends, which I think is kind of interesting. And I like to note that because it is how these changes happen that make you who you are in the different stages of life. So unfortunately, though, it is estrogen in any form that at some point does start to decrease. And that's really when we start to get concerned about bone density and osteoporosis. So one thing I wanted to mention is that for those of you who are not yet at menopause and you want to make sure that you can do everything you can to keep yourself as healthy as possible. The more actually weight-bearing exercise and muscle you build up prior to menopause can create stronger bones for one, but also it has been seen in some studies to actually slow down and delay that ultimate drop in estrogen that happens as you age. So there's a little tip on prevention if you're looking for that. Definitely make sure to be including your strength training and your weight-bearing exercise. It's really, really important. And then we also can't forget to talk about progesterone. So progesterone is a hormone that increases after ovulation. So always remember that in your cycle, you have day 1 to day 15, which is where you have had quite a bit of estrogen that creates a response in the body that releases hormones like LH and FSH, which promote you building and the cyst where the egg is developed in the ovaries. And then of course, there comes a point at around day 14, day 15, where the egg is released into the body or into your fallopian tubes, which makes its way down into the uterus. And progesterone then starts to pick up there. So day 15 to the first day of your period is that latter half. And it's that latter half that we're going to be talking about quite a bit, because it's those changes that can create some issues for women. And progesterone is just a fun hormone, but it can be a bit of a difficult piece for women, because it does create some changes compared to males. Now, keep in mind that when the egg is not fertilized, and when there isn't a pregnancy, then progesterone levels start to drop. And it's those high hormone phases that can create some of our problems. Okay, so really, as I've mentioned, another question I get a lot are really, what are some of the issues that can happen with hormone imbalance? So I mentioned some of the above things like thyroid hormones. We've talked about this a little bit before, in thyroid imbalances. And you can see anything from hypothyroid to hyperthyroid, which hypo is when you don't have enough thyroid hormone. Hyper is when you have a lot of thyroid hormone and it's not being utilized appropriately. So and thyroid symptoms, oftentimes you don't even really have to have a diagnosis. So I have a lot of people that will say, I've run labs and labs and labs and labs, and we just don't see any problems with my thyroid hormones, but I have this list of symptoms. So just keep in mind that there are some things that you can be doing as far as nutrition goes, with zinc and selenium and B vitamins and vitamin C and vitamin D, vitamin A, that all support healthy thyroid hormones. Also, we talked about this last week, but your GI tract can have quite a significant effect on your hormones as well. So it's sometimes about just taking a step back and looking at what is your body doing, and what are some of the things that the warning signals really that it's sending up, and what do we need to do in order to get to the bottom layer of why it's saying there's an issue, and going from there. You don't always need a lab to tell you that there's something going on. Your symptoms usually tell you that there's something going on, and that's why you ended up in the doctor's office in the first place. The other thing too that can happen with thyroid as well that I see a lot of is autoimmune diseases like Graves and Hashimoto's, and those are an entire other topic for sure. Autoimmune diseases is something that's affecting a lot more people in general, but Americans as well. And so it's just, the hormones are a big piece of the body, but they're not the only thing. And they are very influenced by other stuff that happens in the body. And we will talk about that too today. The other thing that we can see as well is high levels of cortisol, that stress hormone, for long periods of time can create inflammation throughout the GI tract, as I just kind of mentioned. And then when the GI tract's inflamed and we just have kind of low levels of inflammation everywhere, we can start to see stress on other joints and muscles and tissues and organ systems in the body, which when an athlete, is saying, I just have all these chronic injuries that keep popping up over and over again, and I don't really know why. Well, sometimes we need to kind of take a step back and wonder, is there some type of low-grade inflammation that's happening? And is it potentially being caused by a hormone imbalance of some type? Also, we see things like infertility a lot when we're looking at issues that pop up with hormones, and weight gain. And as I mentioned before, that definitely does pop up with postmenopause, but we also see a loss of periods with our athletes too. So we call that amenorrhea, and that's just another example of some of the very typical things that we will see when hormones become imbalanced with our athletes. So one thing I also wanted to mention on that too is that amenorrhea is something that we used to see quite a bit. It was as part of what we would call the female triad, and amenorrhea was happening a lot in female athletes that were getting below 11% body fat, because body composition has been one of those things for female athletes, and the way that you look and staying a certain body fat percentage was something that was so important. But news for you, hopefully, is that you don't have to, sometimes you actually really need to have a certain amount of fat and a layer of fat to perform better. So, but one thing that we're seeing is that it's not just those athletes that are under 11% body fat that we're seeing this loss of their period. We're actually seeing it in all ages, and we're also seeing it with all sizes, I suppose, is a good way to say that. So, and really what it seems like amenorrhea is really coming from is basically lifestyle. So again, it's going back to nutrition, it's going back to, high stress, it's going back to not sleeping well, lifestyle factors that really have this impact on the balance of our hormones. So keep that in mind, that it's not just for those super low body fat athletes. We also see things like bone fractures from osteoporosis in postmenopausal athletes, and a bit of weight gain and decreases in tendon strength. So those are just some of the issues and concerns, I would say, that we tend to see quite a bit. And we're going to talk about a bit more for postmenopausal athletes, how to maybe manage this a bit. So the next, of course, is how can hormones impact athletic performance? And we're going to be spending quite a bit of time here. So we're going to start off with body composition, as we kind of just mentioned. Estrogen really promotes storing fat. And that is just one of the things that female athletes have. It's just a piece of it, right? We have estrogen, we have it high in the first part of our cycle, and it is designed to help us store fat because we are supposed to be able to have kids, right? So, and we need to be able to use fat to do that. So what that really means is that we're taking fatty acids from the blood and we're storing them as fat tissue. And estrogen, and it does tend to increase once we do store fat. So the more we have, often the more estrogen is around. And it does actually happen with men as well, talking about that aromatase that we talked about back at the beginning, that once you have more fat mass and higher percentages of body fat, that just tends to kind of snowball a tad bit. But keep in mind, it is actually a natural process and part of the female body to have estrogen and this kind of fat storing piece. But estrogen also can tend to make it a little bit harder for women to make muscle. So when we're talking about how hormones impact athletic performance, especially for female athletes, this does depend a little bit on genetics, but hormones still do play a role in it being a little bit more difficult for women to make and to make muscle. So there's that piece to remember, especially when we're trying to compare between female and male athletes. We also often have faster but more brief bone growth. So again, kind of going back to that tip that I talked about in the beginning, where we want to be doing a little bit more weight-bearing exercise and strength training, because over time, it's that weight-bearing exercise and the strength training where you build up muscles, and the tension that happens when tendons start to pull on bones that's what lays down more bone tissue, which makes your structure stronger. And the more bone growth that you have then means, as you go into post-menopause and into aging, you're going to have more for the body essentially to break down, which delays that as you go. So there really are, if I can't stress enough, coming from also a chiropractic background, keeping your strength training and your weight-bearing exercise up is really important. So let's give you another example of where of this and how hormones kind of interact with athletic performance. So women are typically better at utilizing more fat during exercise than men. A lot of people don't know that, but this happens quite a bit. This basically happens the change actually happens post exercise. Sorry. So women burn more fat during exercise, but where we differ is that men tend to burn more fat after exercise, whereas women will just continue burning carbs for fuel and will go faster back into a fat storing phase. And that is something that we could kind of work with a little bit when we're talking about post-workout recovery. So, and also keeping in mind too, and I'll talk about that at the last, I have some tips and tricks at the end here where we're going to talk about some things that you can do to balance this out. So stay tuned for that. In the latter phase, though, of your hormone cycle, when progesterone is higher, remember we were talking about that day 15 to the first day of your period, when progesterone is on the higher side, it increases your body's muscle breakdown. So this is another impact that hormones can have on athletic performance, particularly for female athletes. Progesterone is present throughout your entire, and it's just always present, but it's just higher towards the end. And the presence of progesterone basically makes it so that your body will break down muscle faster. It's part of how we can sometimes gain energy. It's sometimes, and it's just part of the female process of being able to source things that we need and resources if we're going to be, carrying a child. So, and again, this understanding how nutrition plays into this is why it's really important for women to be focusing on eating enough protein. It's the protein that you get from your nutrition that actually prevents you from going to your muscles to get it. So again, going back to this, we're going to talk about that in the tips and tricks at the end. So stay tuned. Just remember, you do need protein. I can't stress this enough. Please remember that you do need protein in order to rebuild your muscles and recover. So there's another benefit to eating protein as well. It also helps to slow down your body's desire to quickly go back to storing fat. So really making sure that you keep some balance there is really, really key. Then there's also, it's time to be, I think, paying attention a bit to your carbohydrate intake and also sodium intake. So one of the things that happens in that latter half of your cycle is when, again, talking about progesterone, this is the time when you really do want to pay attention to how many carbs your carbohydrate intake, particularly around your workouts and pre-workout. So this is the time when you actually want to increase your carbohydrate intake when you're training or when you're going out to compete versus the earlier half of your period or of your cycle where you can actually lower your carbohydrate intake a little bit. And then again, going back to that, the latter half, so day 15 to day 1 of your cycle, your period, this is also a time where you may want to consider increasing your sodium for the reason of, if you're going to be going out and you're going to be training for long periods of time or for competition, and it's going to be in the heat, it is this period of time that of your monthly cycle where you can have some issues with what we call hyponatremia. So it's difficulty managing your fluids. It's also difficulty with thermoregulation. So keeping yourself cool. Preloading with sodium the night before and then a little bit before your event or competition and a bit throughout the day will really help your body keep that body fluid in balance. So keep that in mind. That's like the biggest tip I can give you is know where you are in your cycle, because that is where you can really use your nutrition and your hormones and leverage them for maintaining a very good balance throughout your training. Also, we mentioned this in the beginning, if you've ever been worried about getting your period on race day, here's something that I really want you to think about. So if you deal with cramping and PMS, bloating, GI complaints, mood swings that usually pop up around your period, I get that that's definitely something that makes not really wanting to compete when you're on your period, that really throws everything off. But it's important to remember that you want to think about ways to reduce inflammation and see if there are some other things that you really need to be working on with your physiology, like your gut and liver function, and maybe even blood sugar control, if those are the things that you experience with your period. Because even though so many women experience them, they're actually not normal. Your period should not be causing a ton of GI problems and bloating and PMS and all of that. So just keep in mind that there's, again, so many things that are happening inside the body that influence your hormones. Going back, blood sugar control, liver, gut, all pieces that we want to be remembering are that they really do control how we produce hormones and how we process and use them. And again, like, there's just so much behind hormone imbalance. So yeah, I do get it. The days leading up to your period, especially if you get cramping during your period, can make exercise feel way more difficult. But I do want you to remember that when your period starts, you're actually at a time when you're physically stronger. Your VO2 max is typically higher, and you have a higher lactate threshold. And also the female body seems to recover faster once you've hit that day one of your cycle. So if you're one of those people that doesn't necessarily have any discomfort during your period, this is definitely a time where you can not shy away from your period as much and kind of maybe lean into it a little bit. Because the low hormone phase really starts when your period does. And when the body is like, oh, we're not going to be pregnant, so I can now put all that energy into other places, women tend to find that they are more powerful during that time. There are some things, though, to keep in mind if you do play sports that require like a fast reaction time or something like that, maybe some, control. I would think maybe like soccer or lacrosse or things like that. We do tend to see a little bit of a lower reaction time, maybe a bit of a harder time focusing. And we do tend to see a bit like your breathing rate tends to lower and your ability to regulate your temperature is a bit lower than normal. But again, there's some things that we already talked about that you can be doing to kind of counteract some of that. So I think what's important is really just knowing that your period doesn't really mean that you're going to perform worse. It's just about knowing what are some of the changes that can happen. And then you can work with that. If you know, okay, I'm going to be playing my sport, I'm going to be competing. And so I know I may have a little bit of a harder time focusing. You can sort of tune into that a little bit more and make sure that you're not, beating yourself up, but also just paying attention. Anyway, things to think about. At this time, though, it's also important that when we're talking about hormones and how we can work with them, I know that a lot of athletes tend to use oral contraceptives to move their period around, especially when they're going to be competing. And this is definitely something that used to happen quite a bit in the older times in the past, just because they didn't do a whole lot of research on hormones for women. They just wanted to kind of like avoid them. So let's talk about how they can impact your performance, because I cannot stress this enough. I think women need to understand what contraceptives do to the body, and also so that you can be better performed and make better decisions for yourself and your health. If I can do anything, that's what I want to give to you. So I want to also stress too that birth control is great for women. They can control their lives. If you don't want to build a family now, if you don't want to continue adding to that family, or if you just don't want to have a family, all of those and having that freedom and those options there is something that is a great thing. So I'm going to talk a bit about what contraceptives can do to the body, but there are some other options. There's some low hormone options, and I just want to make sure that you are fully informed. So one of the first things to keep in mind is that in the second part of your cycle, remember when we were talking about how your hormones are higher, like we talked about, if you actually take hormone birth control, those levels will be even higher. So paying attention to carbohydrates and sodium is really important here. Also, it can cause some slower recovery, and also some regulating your body temperature. So thermoregulation issues will all still apply here. So make sure that you're paying attention to your carbs, sodium, and protein, particularly during that latter half. Also, keeping in mind that weight gain can be a side effect as well of hormonal birth control, and it really appears to blunt women's weight gain, muscle gain. They actually looked at a study, which I've linked in the show notes, that over 10 weeks of resistance exercise training, they found that there was about 40% less gain in lean muscle mass amongst the group of women who were taking oral contraceptives than those who weren't. They also actually found elevated stress hormone, so cortisol, in the bloodstream as well. And I want to go back to talking about, again, we just talked about how, during that high hormone phase with progesterone having an effect on your ability to stay hydrated and manage your cooling and heating during hot race and training days. Please note that your adrenals play a role there. So they produce cortisol, and they also control your kidneys and your heart and the amount of fluids they keep and get rid of. So if there's issues with the adrenals pumping cortisol all the time, there's another possible layer of issues here. And also, not to mention, again, that this can also, those higher levels of cortisol can create and have an impact on your GI tract and overall inflammation. So just remember that so many things are connected here, and it's important that if you do have some issues, find somebody that can help you kind of address what's going on. And if you do have questions about birth control, ask your physicians and things like that, because it is an important piece. I also want to talk a bit too about how there are some issues with birth control, that it does seem like it's giving out like a knee-jerk reaction to things like acne and painful periods, and a lot of hormone-related issues that are just covered up really by taking the pill. For example, taking it for acne, especially for a teenager, without really addressing the food intolerances that can be behind acne, or gut issues, or just even high androgens, which are those reproductive hormones and things like testosterone, which could be really at the root cause of acne. And honestly, when we put birth control in, you're really just creating a space where it allows those issues to still brew underneath the surface. So you don't really address some of the underlying causes. And also keeping in mind that if you are taking birth control over a long period of time, there are some costs and some changes to the control systems for hormones when we see that. So they can alter how we break down and utilize estrogens. And I've even seen a few women in my clinic where they were on they were on birth control for quite a while, and they were really headed down a path where this can lead to an increased risk of breast cancer, just because of how they were managing estrogen and those hormones that increase. Okay. So keep this in mind. And also the pill can also lead to things like zinc deficiencies, vitamin B6, B12, B2, magnesium, selenium, vitamin C, B9. We talked about nutrient deficiencies in the first episode of this season. And I just want to stress that these nutrients are so important for health and athletic performance. But we don't talk about this, right? We don't get this from our physicians when they're giving us these options of, these are the things that you can try. So I really think that staying informed and knowing these impacts is how you can make the best informed decisions for yourself. So we're going to move right along here. We're nearing the end. I just want to talk a little bit more and give a bit to you guys who are on the menopause and post-menopause side of things. So ladies, when menopause creates some changes in the body, I know you start to see things like hot flashes, and then we see maybe some of that pesky weight gain, and it's really hard to stay lean. So here's what ultimately happens. Your estrogen levels fluctuate quite a bit once this all gets started, and it's a bit and it's really that starts that increase in weight that then leads to your body producing more estrogen, which promotes more fat storage. And it's again, cycling back to that aromatase cycle. But it's eventually menopause at the end of menopause and kind of as we go, that we do start to eventually see an overall decline in estrogen. And that's when people start to become a bit more aware of bone loss and concerns like that with age. One thing we didn't talk about much as far as how we create hormones is there is another hormone called DHEA. It's a precursor for hormone production. So it's produced by your adrenal glands, and it helps you utilize glucose as fuel and limits the effects of cortisol just a bit. again, with menopause, DHEA actually drops because you're not producing as much of those hormones as things go. And this is what tends to mess with your metabolism, and it makes your body a bit more sensitive to glucose and insulin. So when you're stressed out and you are in that postmenopausal stage, you really don't have the protective effects that DHEA can give, which will actually make the fat storing worse. And again, what's really important is to remember that, yes, it's knowing these things that are happening in the body, but what can you do about them? So we need to make some shifts with fueling and nutrition. You also don't tend to synthesize protein quite as much when you're in the postmenopausal stage of life, and you tend to burn less fat. So we also see some changes with testosterone and estrogen, and you become a bit more sensitive to insulin, meaning your carbohydrate sources are going to need to shift a bit. And what I have my patients do and my athletes do is I say, let's focus a little bit on eating less of those high glycemic index starchy carbs like white rice, pastas, and breads. And let's focus a little bit more on eating more fruits and veggies. So more quality and quantity of protein and less carbohydrates. Also, if you're in the middle of menopause and hot flashes are keeping you awake, doing what you can to temporarily use maybe hormone replacement therapy, that can be a really helpful resource. And making sure that you're being able to sleep, because that is one of the issues, is that in order for hormone balance, we need to be able to sleep well. But if, hot flashes are waking you up in the middle of the night, that can be really tricky. So sleep is really important. You want to make sure you can use things like melatonin, valerian root, and some other lifestyle changes and like reducing screen time can help to troubleshoot some difficulty with sleep. I really want to break down just a few more things here, and then I'm going to wrap this up. So some other issues that we also tend to see with female athletes pre and post menopause are tendon and ligament issues. Again, part of this comes down to hormones. Women in general have more loosey-goosey joints. It's what's supposed to happen because we are designed to bear children. So it just puts a different pressure on our knees and hips because we are a bit wider usually in the hips, which then means that what we call the Q angle is a little bit different, and that can put more pressure on our knees. And we tend to see more ACL tears in women. We also have a hormone called relaxin that tends to circulate in the body, but definitely much more in pregnancy because that's what helps open up the hips for childbirth. But we do see that still. And so it's understanding that those changes, that those are just there. That's the difference a bit in joint health between females and males. And so there's some things that you can be doing to help kind of strengthen your joints a bit. It's what really ultimately makes us a bit more flexible. The problem, though, again, is going back to, we do tend to see more ligament injuries and tears, specifically ACL tears in the knee in women. So, and I did link a few studies in the show notes that talk about that in a little bit more detail if you wanted to go check those out. So I want to stress again that for you to remember that strength is not the enemy here. A little weight training really goes a long way, as does a bit of that banded resistance training exercises that promote stronger tendons and ligaments. So keep that in mind, that strength training really, really, really is helpful. Now, for postmenopausal women, this is where things can get a little bit tricky. We do want to see stronger muscles and exercise because this does help with keeping estrogen levels in control. It helps keep your bones healthy, all of that. But we do also tend to see a bit more of tendon and ligament tears in postmenopausal athletes. And we think that this may be due to just imbalances with when we build stronger muscles, we can be pulling on weaker tendons. And it does seem to be because we just have lower levels of estrogen at that time, and your tendons have estrogen receptors on them. So just keep that in mind, that we want to be doing some things that do help to build up ligaments and tendons. And also remember that the blood supply to ligaments and tendons is quite low. So getting nutrients to those areas can be a bit tricky when it comes to healing. And again, I know I mentioned it a little bit before, but I know a lot of people ask me about hormone replacement therapy and what's its place and function. So it does seem to have a good amount of benefit for improving muscle strength when partnered with exercise, and it does seem to help reduce body fat. And also it does seem to have a great effect on bone health and promoting strong bones. But HRT may be connected with, again, those weaker tendons. So what I usually say is I promote things like exercises that can promote stronger tendons and ligaments, again, with those kind of banded resistance training. Those can be really helpful here. And also, the possibility of a positive effect of utilizing a collagen-based supplement I linked a couple of studies in the show notes as well that may suggest that taking a collagen-based supplement may help to promote healthier tendons and ligaments. Okay. Just be aware that if you are considering HRT, so hormone replacement therapy post-menopause, that there are really some pros and cons. As you can tell, I'm really more of a fan of doing what you can as natural as possible, but there are definitely some cases where this is helpful. And remember too, that HRT can really be helpful, especially if you are in the middle of hot flashes and menopause and it's just really, really overwhelming and kind of dominating your life. If you can take that while also making some lifestyle shifts and changes like nutrition and stress and all of that, you can use that HRT as kind of like this raft to get you across the river. But once you've made all those changes and you've gotten to the other side, really, we hardly ever take the raft with us, right? So that basically means you can stop taking HRT and continue on with those great lifestyle changes that you've already made. Okay, here's the tips and tricks section, and then we're going to be done. So some basic things that we can do on a daily basis to improve hormones and work with your hormones. First things first, track your cycle, please. Download an app on your phone and track it. Know where you are in your cycle so that you can apply all of these tips here. Know when you need to be consuming more or less carbs. Always make sure you're consuming a bit more protein, and you'll know when you need to potentially increase that sodium if you're going to be going out for a really hot day of training. Protein. Back when I was completing my master's in functional medicine and nutrition, I did my thesis on branched chain amino acids for recovery versus turmeric, and also briefly touched on what vitamin C can do for recovery. And I really think this is important because one thing that I looked at and I saw is that branched chain amino acids are really, really great overall, but they seem to be a little bit even better for women. It's particularly the branched chain amino acid called leucine that you want to, it's the amino acid called leucine that you really want to focus on. So taking a branched chain amino acid supplement before and or after your training can really help with recovery and battling that slower recovery from progesterone. You can also use something like whey protein or eating a hard-boiled egg or chicken breast post-workout. Just please make sure that you're doing this within 30 minutes of your workout. This is where you can have a pretty significant impact on recovery, but also on delaying a little bit of that going back into that fat storage phase. So protein, protein, protein. Also, if you want to figure out how to balance estrogen a little bit better, foods like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, all support healthy hormone levels because they really help the liver break down and process that hormone, which is something we didn't really get into a whole lot today. But eating a wide variety of veggies, including these ones, can really, really, really help. Exercise is also a great part of balancing hormones. Getting in enough sleep is another. And remembering that your gut bacteria play a pretty large role here too. Gut bacteria tend to change as we age, and it can promote a bit of weight gain and imbalances with female hormones pre, during, and post menopause. So making sure that you eat like fermented foods and foods higher in bacteria like yogurt can be particularly helpful for improving overall gut health. But please remember that over-the-counter probiotics they often aren't really doing what you're thinking. So just keep that in mind, that if you are concerned and you want to work on your gut, food first, and then talk with a physician about getting a probiotic that may help. Also, manage your stress. This is a super big piece of manage your cortisol, manage your stress. It's another big piece of hormone balance. Lastly, I just want to make sure that we talk about whether you have amenorrhea or thyroid concerns or other hormone imbalances. There are some tests that can actually show you different precursors for hormones, and it can really lead to more effective and efficient correction of them. please also keep in mind that when you're trying to balance hormones, restoring your body back to healthy hormone levels really relies on gut health. It relies on blood sugar balance and metabolic health in general. It also can sometimes be an area where we need to reduce heavy metal toxicity or chemicals and environmental toxins that we're exposed to and we clean our houses with and we put on our skin. Also, this can be disrupted a bit by mold toxins if you are in an area where mold tends to be pretty prevalent. There's also some areas where your gut and your brain and that whole axis can throw off your hormones. Also, your brain can control parts of your hormones too. So I know that seems like a lot. You're just like, it's just my hormones. It's not all these things, but just keep in mind that it can be a bit more than just your hormones. And then the last piece that I want to send you off with is that remember that your body always functions as a whole. If you strive to eat 9 to 13 servings of fruits and veggies a day, I know work up to that if you haven't gotten there, but eating that many fruits and veggies is where you get those different colors, which means more nutrition. It means also different types of fibers, which help promote healthy bacteria. And then that can overall help how you utilize carbs and proteins and process hormones as well. So a healthy gut is what we want. Okay, that was so much. Thank you for being here. That's our episode for now. I hope that this was really helpful for you if hormones are one of those things that you've been kind of battling with over your course of your training and career as an athlete. You'll be able to see links to the references on wispsports.com. Please make sure to follow Wisp Sports on all social media channels and make sure to share this episode with anyone you think may love it. You can also follow me at Dr. K at Dr. Kirstin, that's DrKirstin on Facebook and Instagram. And you can also find me at drkirstin.com. If you have questions or any comments, you can reach us at info@wispsports.com, and you can always leave a direct message with us over on social media. So thank you again so much for listening. I'll see you on the next episode where we are going to take a deep dive into tips and tricks all about recovery from not only just your training, but also from events and how to really optimize that system. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.